Parents secretly charged 115K on my credit card for my sister's Europe trip, so I reported it as fraud, leading to major family fallout. 3 months ago, I was living what I thought was a pretty normal life. 28 years old, decent job, small apartment in Portland, and finally starting to build some real savings. My credit score was something I was actually proud of for the first time in my adult life. I'd worked hard to get it where it was after some stupid mistakes in college, and I was finally seeing the light at the end of the financial tunnel. My sister had always been the golden child in our family. 2 years younger than me, she'd graduated from college with a degree she never used and had been living at home with our parents ever since. Not that I judged her for it initially, the economy's tough and I understood the struggle. But what started to get under my skin was how our parents treated her like she was still 16 while I'd been completely financially independent since I was 21. The whole thing started when she announced she wanted to take a gap year to travel through Europe. At 26, calling it a gap year seemed a bit ridiculous to me, but whatever. Our parents were completely supportive, talking about how it would be such a great experience for her, how she deserved to see the world, how it would help her find herself. The cost was going to be substantial. She wanted to spend 8 months hitting all the major cities, staying in nice places, eating at good restaurants, the whole 9 yards. I remember sitting at Sunday dinner when they were all discussing the logistics. She'd mapped out this elaborate itinerary that included Paris, Rome, Barcelona, Amsterdam, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, and about 10 other cities. She wanted to take cooking classes in Italy, attend art workshops in France, learn photography in Eastern Europe. It sounded amazing, honestly, and I felt a twinge of jealousy that I'd never had that kind of freedom or family support to just explore the world on someone else's dime. My parents seemed stressed about the money aspect, though they were trying to hide it. They'd been talking about refinancing the house, maybe taking out a loan against their retirement savings. I could see the worry lines forming around my mother's eyes when she thought no one was looking. My father had been working extra shifts and seemed constantly tired. But they were determined to make it happen for her because that's what parents do, they said. Being the older brother, I felt this weird obligation to help out. I'd been saving money for a down payment on a house and I had about $30,000 tucked away. I offered to lend them $15,000 to help with the trip costs, figuring it would ease some of their financial burden and I could still keep enough for my own goals. They seemed incredibly grateful, almost emotional about it. My mother actually teared up and thanked me for being such a good brother. We set up a payment plan where they'd pay me back $500 a month starting when she got back from the trip. Nothing too aggressive, just enough that I'd have my money back within a few years. I even drew up a simple agreement and had them sign it, not because I didn't trust them, but because I wanted to keep things professional and clear. Money and family can get messy, and I'd seen too many relationships destroyed over financial misunderstandings. The day before my sister left, she gave me this huge hug and thanked me for making her dream possible. She seemed genuinely appreciative, which made me feel good about the decision. She promised to send me photos and updates from all the amazing places she'd visit. For the first time in years, our family felt really close and united around something positive. For the first few weeks, I got regular updates. Photos from London, messages about the incredible museums in Paris, excitement about the food in Italy. She seemed to be having the time of her life, and honestly, I was living vicariously through her adventures. My parents seemed more relaxed too, now that the financial stress of funding the trip was behind them. But then something weird started happening with my credit card statements. I always check them carefully, a habit I developed after those college mistakes I mentioned. In late July, I noticed some charges I didn't recognize. They were small at first, maybe a couple $100s here and there, charged to what looked like European businesses. Hotels, restaurants, tour companies. At first, I figured it might be some kind of fraud or maybe mistaken charges from when I'd traveled to Seattle for work a few months earlier. I called the credit card company to dispute the charges, expecting it to be a simple process. But when they started investigating, things got complicated fast. The charges were being made with the physical card, not just the numbers. Someone had my actual card and was using it across Europe. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. The charges started right around when my sister arrived in London and seemed to follow her itinerary almost exactly. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. The charges weren't random fraud, they were my sister's expenses, somehow being charged to my card instead of whatever payment method she was supposed to be using. I immediately called my parents to ask about it, thinking there might be some innocent explanation. Maybe there was a mix-up with the cards, or maybe she'd borrowed mine for some emergency and forgotten to tell me. But when I called, something felt off about their responses. They seemed nervous, evasive. They kept saying they'd look into it, that there must be some mistake, that they'd call me back after they figured out what was happening. But that call back never came. When I tried calling again the next day, they seemed to avoid my calls entirely. The charges kept coming, not just small ones anymore, but big ones. Luxury hotel stays, expensive restaurants, private tour guides, first-class train tickets between cities. Each day brought new charges and the total was climbing fast. Within 2 weeks, I was looking at over $20,000 in charges I never authorized. This was money I didn't have. I'd already lent them $15,000, and now my credit card was being maxed out on top of that. I started documenting everything obsessively. Screenshots of every charge, notes about the timing and locations, trying to piece together what was happening. The pattern was undeniable. Every charge corresponded exactly with my sister's social media posts about where she was and what she was doing. She'd post about staying at some fancy hotel in Rome, and sure enough, there would be a charge from that exact hotel on my card the same day. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake at night doing math in my head, trying to figure out how I was going to handle this financially. The interest on the credit card alone was going to be brutal if I couldn't pay it off quickly. I started having anxiety attacks thinking about how this would destroy my credit score and set me back years in my financial goals. After 3 weeks of trying to reach my parents and getting nowhere, I decided I had to take action. I couldn't let this continue. The charges were now totaling over $40,000 and there was no end in sight. My sister still had months left on her trip, and if the spending continued at this rate, I'd be looking at financial ruin. I called the credit card company again and formally reported the charges as fraud. I explained that someone had gained access to my card without my permission and was using it internationally. The customer service representative was sympathetic and immediately froze my account to prevent any additional charges. They started a formal investigation and told me I'd need to file a police report to support my fraud claim. Filing that police report was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Sitting in the police station, explaining to the officer that I suspected my own family members of credit card fraud felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been raised to believe about family loyalty. But I was in a corner. I couldn't afford to let this continue, and my parents had made it clear they weren't going to address it voluntarily. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement got involved. Bank records made it easy to trace exactly how the fraud had occurred, and the truth was so much worse than I'd imagined. My parents hadn't just given my sister access to my card for emergencies, they'd systematically planned this whole thing from the beginning. When they'd asked me to lend them money for the trip, they'd already decided that wouldn't be enough to cover the kind of extravagant European adventure my sister wanted. So they'd taken photos of my credit card when I wasn't looking during one of those family dinners. They'd used those photos to create a duplicate card, which they'd given to my sister to use throughout her trip. The plan was apparently to pay off the charges gradually after she returned, without me ever knowing about it. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They'd researched which merchants in Europe were less likely to check signatures carefully. They'd coached my sister on how to use the card without raising suspicions. They'd even planned out a story about how there must have been some kind of banking error if I ever noticed the charges, buying themselves time to figure out how to cover their tracks. What made it even worse was discovering that the $15,000 I'd loaned them hadn't gone toward the trip at all. They'd used it to pay down their own debts, figuring they'd eventually pay me back for money they saved by using my credit card for the trip expenses. It was layer upon layer of deception, and each new detail made me feel more betrayed and stupid for trusting them. By the time the investigation was complete, the total fraudulent charges had reached over $70,000. $70,000 charged to my credit cards without my knowledge or consent, while I was getting thank you hugs and being told what a wonderful brother I was for helping out with the family finances. The legal consequences for my parents were severe. Credit card fraud at that level is a felony, especially when it crosses international borders. They were facing potential jail time, massive fines, and complete financial ruin. My sister, as an adult who'd knowingly participated in the scheme, was also facing serious legal consequences despite being overseas. But the legal system moved slowly, and in the meantime, I was still stuck with the financial consequences. Even though the charges were fraudulent, getting them removed from my credit report and getting my money back was a complex process that took months. I had to close all my credit accounts, dispute every single charge individually, and provide documentation for everything. My credit score took a massive hit just from having those charges appear, even though they were eventually removed. The family fallout was immediate and devastating. When my parents realized I'd actually followed through with reporting them to the police, they were furious. They accused me of destroying the family over money, of being selfish and vindictive, of not understanding that everything they'd done was for the good of the family. They painted me as the villain in the whole situation, the ungrateful son who turned on his own parents over a few credit card charges. My sister cut her trip short and came home when she learned about the investigation, but instead of being apologetic, she was angry at me too. She felt I'd ruined her once-in-a-lifetime experience by being petty about money. She moved back in with our parents and joined them in treating me like I was the bad guy in the whole situation. Extended family members started taking sides, and most of them sided with my parents and sister. The story they told was that I'd offered to help with the trip, then changed my mind and decided to get my family arrested over it. They left out the part about the systematic fraud, the deception, the fact that I'd never consented to any of the charges. Family gatherings became impossible. Holidays were awkward and tense when I tried to attend, and eventually I just stopped going. The isolation was crushing. These were people I'd grown up with, people I'd shared decades of memories with, and suddenly I was completely cut off from all of them. I started questioning whether I'd done the right thing, whether I should have just found a way to absorb the financial loss to keep the family together. The guilt was eating me alive, even though I knew logically that I'd been the victim in the situation. Work became my escape. I threw myself into projects, stayed late at the office, volunteered for extra assignments. Anything to avoid going home to my empty apartment and thinking about the family I'd lost. My coworkers started noticing that I seemed stressed and withdrawn, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what was happening. How do you tell people that your own parents committed felony fraud against you and now your entire family hates you for reporting it? The financial stress was overwhelming too. Even though the fraudulent charges were eventually removed, the whole process had cost me thousands of dollars in fees, interest, and lost opportunities. I'd had to delay my house buying plans indefinitely. I'd maxed out my savings dealing with the immediate crisis. My carefully planned financial future had been completely derailed by people I'd trusted completely. 6 months after everything started, I got a call from a lawyer representing my parents. They were willing to make a deal to avoid jail time. They'd plead guilty to reduce charges, pay restitution, and accept probation instead of prison sentences. But the restitution amount was more than they could realistically pay, and they wanted me to agree to accept partial payments spread out over many years. Part of me wanted to refuse to let them face the full consequences of their actions. They'd betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible, then tried to make me the villain when I'd stood up for myself. But another part of me was tired of the whole situation and just wanted it to be over. I was tired of being angry, tired of dealing with lawyers and court dates, tired of the whole mess consuming my life. I agreed to the deal, but with conditions. They had to pay back every penny of the fraudulent charges plus interest, even if it took decades. They had to acknowledge in writing that what they'd done was wrong and that I'd had every right to report it. And most importantly, they had to stop trying to turn the rest of the family against me by telling their version of events. The acknowledgement part was harder for them than the money. Admitting they'd been wrong meant giving up the narrative that I was the bad guy, and that narrative had become their way of coping with the guilt and shame of what they'd done. But eventually they agreed to everything, and the legal case was finally resolved. Getting that written acknowledgement didn't magically repair our relationship, though. Too much damage had been done, too many hurtful things had been said. They'd shown me that their love came with conditions, that they were willing to steal from me if it benefited my sister, that they were willing to destroy my reputation to protect themselves. Trust, once broken that completely, doesn't just grow back. My sister eventually reached out to apologize, about a year after everything had settled legally. She claimed she hadn't fully understood what was happening at the time, that our parents had convinced her it was all arranged and legitimate. She said she'd been young and naive and had trusted them to handle the financial arrangements properly. Part of her apology felt genuine, but part of it felt like damage control, like she was trying to rehabilitate her image now that the legal consequences were behind her. I accepted her apology but kept my distance. The sister who'd hugged me and thanked me for making her dreams possible had knowingly spent months using my credit card in Europe while I was struggling with anxiety and financial stress back home. That person had been willing to participate in systematically defrauding me as long as it meant she could live her fantasy lifestyle. I couldn't just forget that version of her existed. The extended family situation never really recovered. Once people choose sides in a family conflict like this, it's hard to walk it back. Even after the truth came out, even after my parents admitted they'd been wrong, most of my relatives continued to treat me like I'd overreacted. They seemed to think that keeping the family together should have been more important than my financial well-being or my right not to be stolen from. I started building a new social circle, focusing on friendships rather than family relationships. I joined hiking groups, started taking cooking classes, got involved in community volunteering. These were people who didn't have decades of complicated family history with me, who could get to know me as I actually was rather than as the person my family had decided I was. Slowly, I started to rebuild my financial life too. It took almost 2 years to fully recover from the credit damage, to rebuild my savings, to get back on track with my house buying goals. But in some ways, going through that crisis taught me valuable lessons about financial independence and the importance of protecting myself. I learned to be more careful about mixing money and family relationships, more aware of the signs of financial manipulation. Dating became complicated in ways I hadn't expected. How do you explain to someone new that you're not close with your family because they committed fraud against you? It sounds made up, like something you'd make up to avoid introducing someone to difficult relatives. But the truth was the truth, and I had to learn to tell it matter-of-factly and let people draw their own conclusions. Some people couldn't handle it, They'd hear the story and decide I must be the problem somehow, that normal families don't end up in situations like that. But others understood that sometimes families are complicated, that being related to someone doesn't automatically make them trustworthy or safe. Those were the people worth getting to know better. 3 years later, I bought my first house. It was smaller than I'd originally planned, in a different neighborhood than I'd first considered, but it was mine. Signing those papers felt like more than just a real estate transaction. It felt like proof that I'd survived the worst crisis of my adult life and come out stronger. I'd rebuilt my credit, my savings, my sense of financial security, all without help from the family that had nearly destroyed it. I get Christmas cards from my parents now, awkward attempts at maintaining some connection. They're always signed with love and include updates about mundane family news, as if we're working towards some eventual reconciliation. I respond politely but don't encourage deeper contact. Some relationships can't be repaired, no matter how much time passes or how sorry people claim to be. My sister got married last year to someone she met through work. I wasn't invited to the wedding, which was probably for the best. I heard through mutual acquaintances that it was a small ceremony, that she looked happy, that she and her husband bought a house in the suburbs. I genuinely hope she's found the stability and happiness that she was searching for during that European adventure that cost us our relationship. The strangest part of the whole experience was how it changed my relationship with money itself. Before this happened, I'd been focused on accumulating savings and building wealth for future goals. After going through the trauma of having my financial security threatened by people I trusted, money became more about safety and independence. I became more conservative with investments, more careful about who I shared financial information with, more focused on having emergency funds that only I could access. But I also became more generous in some ways. When friends were going through tough times, I was more willing to help out, partly because I understood how it felt to have your financial foundation shaken. I started donating more to causes I cared about, partly because having gone through a period where I might have lost everything made me more aware of how fortunate I was to have recovered. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd handled things differently. If I'd confronted my parents directly instead of going to the police, if I'd been willing to absorb the financial loss to keep the family together, if I'd found some middle ground that avoided the legal consequences and family fracture. But then I remember how they responded when I tried to talk to them before involving law enforcement. They were evasive, deceptive, clearly planning to continue the fraud until my sister's trip was over. The truth is, they made their choices long before I made mine. They chose to betray my trust, to steal from me, to involve my sister in their scheme, to risk destroying our family relationships for the sake of funding a luxury vacation. I just chose not to be a victim of those choices, even when standing up for myself came with devastating personal costs. These days, I'm genuinely happy with the life I've built. I have good friends, a job I enjoy, a house I love, financial security I've earned through my own efforts. The family relationships I lost were real and meaningful, and I still grieve for them sometimes. But they were also built on foundations that turned out to be less solid than I'd believed. Learning that was painful, but it was also necessary. The whole experience taught me that family loyalty has limits, that being related to someone doesn't give them the right to harm you, that sometimes protecting yourself requires difficult choices that other people won't understand or support. Those are hard lessons, but they're valuable ones. I'm stronger now, more independent, more careful about trust, but also more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges come my way. If I could go back and prevent the whole thing from happening, I probably would. The financial stress, the family fallout, the legal complications, the years of rebuilding, none of it was fun to live through. But since I can't change what happened, I'm grateful for what I learned about myself and about the importance of setting boundaries, even with the people you love most. Sometimes people ask me if I regret reporting my parents to the police, if I think the punishment was too harsh for what they did. My answer is always the same: I didn't choose their punishment, I just chose not to be complicit in my own victimization. They had opportunities to come clean, to work with me to solve the problem, to take responsibility for their actions. They chose deception and blame instead, and the consequences that followed were the natural result of those choices. The credit card fraud was just the surface of something much deeper. A family dynamic where my needs and boundaries were less important than my sister's wants, and my parents' desire to give her everything she asked for. Reporting the fraud was really about refusing to accept that dynamic anymore, about insisting that I deserved to be treated with basic respect and honesty, even by people who claimed to love me. In the end, that may have been the most valuable thing I gained from the whole experience: the knowledge that I can survive losing everything that feels important, that I can rebuild from scratch, that I don't need anyone's approval or acceptance to live a good life. It's a hard way to learn that lesson, but once you know it, really know it, it changes everything about how you move through the world.